Hello, History 72B Spring Quarter 2023. We have 8 weeks left of the quarter, which means we're 1/5 of the way through. I haven't read all of your quiz answers, but from the ones that I've seen, it looks like you all are doing a great job. This lecture is the intro for Package B. Name of Package B is Enforcing Sex and Race in the U.S. by Controlling Family Structure. Barbara and Karen Fields have coined the term racecraft to indicate the process that transforms racism, something that an aggressor does, into race, something the target is. Target and aggressor are important here, as racisms, plural, are constantly made and remade to suit specific historical contexts. The morphable nature of constructions of race and racisms is highly visible in the response of white Americans to Asian American immigration. This, in turn, has had a deep impact on many different Asian American communities. Stanford law professor Bill Ong-Heng wrote in 1993 that policymakers, commentators, and experts appear to me to know little about or to misunderstand Asian American demographics. They seemed not even to understand that there are multiple Asian American communities rather than some single monolithic one. They were both unaware of and seemingly uninterested in how demographics affect the experiences of Asian Americans. Most experts just do not have a full sense of the history of Asian Americans. I will try to keep this in mind as I go through this lecture, but please don't hesitate to contact me if you think I've muffed it in parts or all. I've broken Lecture 6 into 2 parts in order to make it more approachable for both you and me. The first part here will focus on the context that surrounded Asian American immigration, focusing on white American responses as these shaped laws and policies at all levels, from the municipal or city government to U.S. national government. The second part will be in another video, and we'll discuss in more detail the way that immigration law worked through sex and gender to control populations of Asian Americans and the way that they responded to this. In part 1 here, we will look at the way that alternating periods of encouragement and denial of immigration worked their way through a variety of Asian countries in response to political context on both sides and labor desires at the local level in the Pacific U.S. I find it easier to visualize events that overlap using a timeline. I will include a copy of this timeline in files, but it shows the repeating pattern that I'm talking about. National, state, and local leaders supported recruitment of Asian Americans, that would be white leaders, supported recruitment of Asian immigrants as labor for fields, mines, railroads, and for domestic help. The point was sometimes to undercut white workers, but often it was to fill positions left vacant by white American workers. Either way, white working-class Americans resented the hiring practices and labor conditions overall. White workers couldn't touch bosses and had already developed the practice of creating racisms with Native Americans and African Americans. Predictably, they directed their anger at Asian immigrants. Once their labor could be replaced or was no longer needed, then the national government would step in to limit and control immigration of particular Asian groups in response to popular white angst and prejudice. Control over Asian American lives took shape through discriminatory rules on land ownership, business operations, education, civil rights, and taxes, in addition to direct immigration laws, all of which impacted family and community structure. The first group of Asian immigrants who came to North America in appreciable numbers came from China, beginning in the 1840s. They were pushed from China by famine, war, and Britain's imperial ambitions, and they were pulled to North America by the lure of gold and food. Initially, these Chinese immigrants were officially welcomed, receiving accolades for their work ethic and abilities. You are looking at a group of miners working side by side, 4 from China and 3 from either Europe or the US. American employers sent agents to recruit Chinese labor for mining, laundry, domestic service, and especially the railroads. It is widely understood that without Chinese labor, the Transcontinental Railroad would not have existed for decades longer if it were finished at all. Chinese immigrants were highly sought for hard labor because they accepted dangerous jobs, did them well, and demanded low wages compared to other groups. Employers loved Chinese laborers while they were laboring. White laborers did not share that enthusiasm, as they lost jobs or believed that they did to Chinese workers. The first laws that negatively affected Chinese immigrants were actually aimed at Latinos. To reduce competition for gold, Irish, German, and white American miners called for the expulsion of Latino miners. California responded with state and local laws that demanded exorbitant taxes from anyone deemed not American, meaning not white. Latinos chose to leave rather than to pay the ridiculous taxes. And with their departure, the Chinese immigrants, who were lower in number, became ever more visible to resentful whites. New taxes aimed at foreign miners, but now specifically aimed at Chinese immigrants, cropped up in Oregon as well as California. San Francisco and other newspapers published vituperative anti-Chinese editorials, stoking the cycle of fear, anger, and rejection. With the completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869, that's on your timeline, Chinese labor became less indispensable to the big venture capitalists backing the scheme. Chinese labor was still needed to make other railroad branches, but those who built railroads got grants of land and money from the US government. They could afford to drive harder bargains with labor and to indulge anti-Chinese white laborers by making life far more difficult for Chinese immigrants. National laws placed increasing restrictions on legal Chinese immigration, relegating laborers to an increasingly tenuous and dangerous position. In 1870, Chinese immigrants were denied the right to become naturalized citizens. In 1875, the U.S. Congress passed the Page Law. Supposedly, this legislation aimed to prevent the importation of women for, quote-unquote, immoral purposes. In reality, all Chinese women were assumed to be prostitutes by immigration officials. Wives were permitted to join male merchants, teachers, and students, but they had to supply incontrovertible in the mind of immigration officials evidence that they were married, a process that could take years. This effectively left Chinese laborers without families that included women and skewed sex ratios to almost totally male. By this time, anti-Chinese sentiment had spread beyond the West to states like Alabama, Ohio, West Virginia, and Wisconsin, well in advance of appreciable numbers of actual Chinese people. The U.S. Congress responded to nationwide anti-Chinese prejudice with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which did exactly what it sounds like and banned Chinese immigration for a period of 10 years. The 1888 Scott Act prohibited the entry of all Chinese laborers, including those who had left the U.S. temporarily with valid return permits. Those who were visiting family when the law was passed were prevented from returning, even if they had received explicit permission to return before leaving. The Scott Act was followed in 1892 by the Geary Act. And I'll just insert here, you don't need to remember the names of these acts. You just need to notice the escalating legal control over Chinese immigrants. The Scott Act was followed in 1892 by the Geary Act, which required all Chinese people who had entered the U.S. legally or who had been born in the U.S. to register. Lack of registration would lead to deportation, even of legal residents and birthright citizens. In 1904, the U.S. renewed the Chinese Exclusion Act indefinitely. It would be World War II and the invasion of China by Japan before Chinese exclusion began to lighten. Early Japanese immigration followed a very different path to Chinese. Unlike China under the struggling Qing dynasty, which actually collapsed in 1911, Japan's restored Meiji government was strong, and Japan was able to make mutually beneficial treaties with the U.S. This had a profound effect on the specifics of the course of immigration. Initially, Japan industrialized rapidly and joined in international commerce. The Meiji government, however, strictly regulated travel to students, bureaucrats, and statesmen. And you see bureaucrats and statesmen here. In the 20-year period between 1860 and 1880, around 200,000 Chinese laborers entered the U.S. Japan permitted only 335 specially chosen immigrants. After the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 took effect, Hawaii and California desperately needed agricultural labor. Japan and the U.S. worked out a system by which government-sponsored contract laborers could travel to Hawaii, in particular, to work in sugar fields by 1885, although Hawaii would not be officially annexed by the United States until 1898. As with Chinese laborers, Japanese laborers were initially welcomed. Unlike Chinese immigrants, however, most Japanese immigrants did not go to the mainland U.S. at first and did not attract the direct attention of a resentful white working class. When Japanese men immigrated, they were also able to bring wives and children, families, with them. Korean immigration to the U.S. was tied up with political relations with Japan. The U.S. and Korea entered into a treaty of amity and trade in 1882, but very few Koreans came to the U.S. until about 1902. Between 1902 and 1905, around 7,000 Korean laborers came to the U.S., all of them to Hawaii. In 1905, Japan claimed Korea as a Japanese protectorate and clamped down on immigration out of Korea. By 1900, enough Japanese laborers had come to the U.S. mainland to arouse the ire of the white working class. Unlike earlier Chinese immigrants fleeing poverty, Japanese agricultural workers tended to be financially independent. They came with the intention of eventually becoming independent farmers. In California, these Japanese immigrants were met with violence as well as resentment. Meanwhile, Japan defeated the Russian Navy in 1905, making Japan a world power, and the U.S. unwilling to try making laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act aimed at Japanese immigrants. Theodore Roosevelt famously brokered the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1908. Japan agreed to limit the immigration of new laborers, while the U.S. agreed to accept the families of Japanese men on the mainland U.S. This would set up a very different dynamic in Japanese American communities than in Chinese American ones. Immigration from the Philippines followed the same pattern of acceptance for labor, followed by rejection and exclusionary efforts that we've seen with Chinese and then Japanese immigration to the U.S. The U.S. claimed the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. President McKinley decided that the Philippines were incapable of self-government, a move which, understandably, angered Filipinos. However, as non-citizen nationals of the United States, Filipinos could travel to the U.S. without regard to immigration laws. Even the massive 1924 Immigration Act that set quotas for Europeans, and we'll hear more about that later, and eliminated all immigration from Asia, did not affect Filipinos legally, but anti-Asian sentiment did have an impact. White Americans had rejected Chinese and Japanese immigrants as too different, as unassimilable. They resented Filipinos for their ease in assimilating and finding jobs, particularly as the Great Depression began to bite. Exclusionists, anti-colonialists, and Filipino nationalists found common cause promoting the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1934. With this act, the Philippines were to become independent, but Filipinos in the U.S., already in the U.S., would retroactively be subject to immigration laws they had not been affected by before. But that takes us up to the 1930s. Next lecture, we will backtrack and look at how these different patterns of law and practice affected the formation of different Asian American communities by manipulating family structures and how these communities responded. Key points for Lecture 6, Part 1, Module B. Immigration from regions of Asia to the U.S. followed a repeating pattern in which incomers were initially welcomed for their labor, but then subject to extreme racial prejudice. From cities to the national government, policies and laws penalized and regulated immigration from Asia, even while the labor of these immigrants remained essential to businesses like agriculture and railroads. Chinese immigrants began to arrive in appreciable numbers in the 1840s, pushed by famine and pulled by the discovery of gold. Chinese laborers were essential to the successful construction of the first transcontinental railroad in the U.S. Once the railroad was complete, the U.S. government enacted an increasingly restrictive series of laws to limit Chinese immigration. Chinese communities ended up being heavily skewed male because laborers could not bring wives or families. The Page Law of 1875 made the uneven sex ratio in Chinese American communities greater by labeling all Chinese women seeking to immigrate as sex workers and requiring prospective immigrants to provide definitive proof that they were not. The Chinese Exclusion Law of 1882 made immigration from China illegal. Japanese immigration followed the same cycle of acceptance and rejection that Chinese immigrants had faced, but the Japanese government and military were stronger than China's Qing dynasty, making the specifics on the ground quite different. Japanese laborers brought wives and families with them from the very beginning. Immigration from Korea was limited, first by Korea's own government and then by Japan. Filipino immigration to the U.S. was not limited during the period in which the U.S. claimed the Philippines, but Filipino laborers faced resentment from white workers because of Filipinos assimilated so well into American culture and society. In my last coda, I picked apart John Galt's 1872 painting, American Progress, and we got our first look at Columbia, an allegory or personification of the U.S. In this coda, we will put Columbia into a more broad Atlantic context and examine why that particular allegory is so little known in the 21st century. These are propaganda posters from World War II, which we will get to later in the course. These posters were intended to get Americans to support the U.S. government and American participation in World War II. Americans were being asked to enlist in the Army on the left, refrain from discussing any information that might be useful to Axis powers on the right, and to buy war bonds to help fund America's efforts in World War II in the middle here. Everyone in the mid-20th century, indeed many people now, understand that this character on all of these posters is Uncle Sam, a personification of the U.S., particularly of its government. The propaganda posters do not need to say, the US government wants you to enlist in the army, or rather they do say that, but through symbols rather than text alone. We're moving back in time here. The last slide was World War II, mid-20th century. This is the end of World War I, 1918. This poster dates from just after the conclusion of World War I, which happened in November of 1918. Uncle Sam is represented here, linking arms with a woman in classical draperies, wearing a Roman helmet and carrying a shield and trident. The woman is Britannia, and she was and still is the symbol for Great Britain. The pugnacious male character of Uncle Sam is juxtaposed to the female Britannia, whose appearance suggests antiquity. The poster appeared just at the time when the United States was shifting into the role of caretaker of the world. This poster alludes to the fact that the United States provided crucial help to Britain in order to bring World War I to an end. Britannia may be a strong goddess in this poster, but she needed the modern masculine United States wearing the pants in order to win World War I. These are propaganda posters for World War I made during the war as opposed to after victory. The posters are quite similar to the World War II propaganda posters, except that rather than Uncle Sam, America was represented by a woman who bears a striking resemblance to Britannia. Columbia is America as Britannia is Britain. In the poster on the far right, it is Columbia who is calling for men to enlist in the U.S. Army. She is not named in the two posters on the left, but they would have been easily read in the second decade of the 20th century. In the middle, Columbia, symbolizing the U.S. and implying the U.S. people as well as government, wants folks to buy war bonds to fund the war if they cannot enlist and fight for the U.S. On the far left, Columbia, meaning the United States, wants Americans to support the troops in some way that would have been legible to Americans during World War I. Columbia was deliberately modeled on Britannia. Britannia is on the left on the necklace pendant there. The middle image is an allegory of America, so before Columbia proper, from the 1790s, and it's labeled, and you can see already where things are heading by the totality of the image. The figure on the right is Columbia, America proper, drawn in 1800. Columbia stood for the United States before Uncle Sam. You will still see Columbia occasionally, but most Americans have no idea what they are looking at when they see her. The transition to the man in trousers from the woman in classical drapery occurred just at the time that the United States was becoming a world power. This poster from 1898 shows Columbia and Uncle Sam for the US, and Britannia and someone called John Bull for Great Britain. John Bull came into existence earlier than Uncle Sam, and while the two seem analogous and are often discussed that way, John Bull never replaced Britannia the way that Uncle Sam replaced Columbia. The analogy is often made by gender sex even now, John Bull to Uncle Sam and Britannia to Columbia, but it is Britannia and Uncle Sam that came or stayed to the fore as consistent symbols of national greatness, as opposed to being mainly caricatures in political satire. John Bull appeared as a character in political satires at the very beginning of the 18th century. John Bull was meant to represent the typical Englishman in the mind of white Englishmen, an honest, plain-dealing fellow, choleric, bold, and a very inconstant temper. The character was picked up as a caricature by satirists and cartoonists through the 18th century. John Bull was a drinking man, hard-headed, down-to-earth, averse to intellectualism, fond of dogs, horses, ale, and country sports. This describes a prosperous country gentleman, not so much a member of the working class or the British people proper. From the Napoleonic Wars through World War II, John Bull became more representative of the working man on the street. During the Napoleonic Wars, John Bull appeared as the antithesis of the effete Frenchman. John Bull became a personification of the character of the English people, affable, honest, generous, straightforward, with a zest for life, and ready to stand up and fight for what he believed in, but also not particularly bright and proud of that. Britannia remained the representation of Great Britain as a civilized and civilizing imperial power. Both of these cartoons from the early 19th century show Britannia as the power of the British nation, her power supported by the stout heart of John Bull. Columbia and Uncle Sam exhibited American 19th century gendered ideas of empire and power right from the start. The two figures overlapped for a while, but each was used to convey different and very 19th century messages, and I'll show those in just a moment. The industrializing West, Britain, France, the US, so on, celebrated themselves in spectacles called World's Fairs. The first of these was the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industrial Nations, or just the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London. But the US would go on to present World's Fairs in cities like Chicago and St. Louis. The posters advertising these expositions reveal a great deal about the way that white America pictured the roles of men and women, not to mention other nations. Uncle Sam appeared most often in contexts asserting the U.S. as a growing world power, as at the Columbian Exposition of 1893, where Columbia was shown standing behind Uncle Sam, signifying the character of the U.S. as a generous, nurturing, supportive presence. This dynamic of Uncle Sam as embodying an aggressive, often violent form of masculinity, and Columbia offering a generous, motherly hand, showed up frequently in other contexts beyond the World's Fairs. I have only put one here and I've cropped it. They tend to show the non-Western world as children in need of care and discipline, female and male roles respectively, within hegemonic white American family ideals. If you've watched the last lecture or coda, you've seen this painting already, and you are likely to see it again if you carry on in American history. The overall symbology here is so blatantly obvious that it makes it fairly easy to use the image as a quick illustration of hegemonic white American attitudes of the 19th century. Gast painted this in 1872. It illustrates a retrospective interpretation of the first half of the 19th century. The woman in white floating strangely over everything is the allegorical figure of Columbia representing the United States. The figure is female, but only as a symbol. Columbia does not represent flesh and blood women. It is glaringly obvious that the allegory of the US here was conceived of as white and blonde. The control of white women symbolized the control of the nation and legitimized the idea of the United States as a nation of white people. Columbia is classically draped in the white of purity, but with both breasts covered, no matter how improbable or uncomfortable the placement on her upper left might appear. In the painting, Columbia is literally bringing the light of American civilization associated with femininity from the East to the West, but in a gentle and seemingly effortless manner that belies reality. Contrast this to Britannia. Columbia emerged from Britannia and was modeled on Britannia. But while Britannia looks ready to defend the British Isles with the strength of a lion, she has her lion next to her, Columbia looks soft, not so muscled, and she carries nothing in the way of weapon or armor or lions. Marianne was the allegory of France from the French Revolution on. You see her on the left here. I've cropped the image, but she is trampling corpses on a battlefield. I leave you to draw your own comparisons between Marianne and this representation of Columbia.